You can go to a place, a garage, you can buy a Rolls Royce if you've got the money. It's 20 or 30,000 pounds. It's settled in a few days. But to buy a little house, £20,000, you've got all this legal jargon that goes through and costs and so on. Why should it be like that? Is it a rake-off?
The amount of power the ground landlord has got is totally out of proportion. It's just not fair.
Two people who've both been on the receiving end of the leasehold system. Pat Clancy is a pensioner living in a terraced house in Cardiff. Susan Scoon is a young married woman with a home on a modern estate near Pontypridd. Campaigns for reform of the system over the decades have met with varied success, and the latest attempt is now underway in the Commons, where the MP for Gower, Gareth Wardell, is promoting a bill to abolish leasehold. He and other Welsh MPs were spurred into action because of complaints they'd received about one company, Castlebeg Investments of Jersey, who own the ground under more than 10,000 homes in South Wales.
The leasehold system is archaic, iniquitous and inequitable. Leasehold tenure is essentially a landlord versus tenant relationship. Therefore, it will always be incompatible with the rights of home ownership, which we associate as being free from intimidation and security of tenure, freedom of choices related to our home, and eventually full rights of home ownership. A ground landlord buys a freehold for perhaps £300. On site is a house for which the owner paid, say, £30,000. The homeowner pays the landlord ground rent of perhaps £30 a year. But the power of the landlord is completely disproportionate to the interest he has purchased in his property. In return for allowing a home to be on his land, the landlord can insist on a quite amazing number of restrictions and obligations from the tenant. As the Building Societies Association report on leaseholding states, an Englishman's home, if held on leasehold, is his landlord's castle. I am sure, Mr. Speaker, that exactly the same is true, if not more so, of the Welshman's home.
Gareth Wardell in the Commons last month. Welsh members of Parliament have spearheaded the attack on leasehold for almost 80 years. In 1909, Lloyd George was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and his budget was causing great agitation among the propertied classes because in it he planned to introduce new taxes on the huge incomes they derived from the ownership of land. On July the 30th, the Welsh wizard spoke at Limehouse in East London, and leasehold was one of his targets.
Look at all this leasehold system. This system, it is the system I am attacking, not individuals, is not business. It is blackmail. Ground rent is a part of it. Fines, fees. You are to make no alteration without somebody's consent. Who is that somebody? It is the agent of the landlord, a fee for him. You must submit the plans to the landlord's architect and get his consent. There is a fee for him. There is a fee, too, to the surveyor, and then, of course, you cannot keep the lawyer out. He always comes in, and a fee for him. Well, that is the system. And the landlords come to us in the House of Commons, and they say, if you go on taxing reversions, we will grant no more leases. Is not that horrible? No more leases, no more kindly landlords with all their retinue of good fairies, agents, surveyors, lawyers, ready always to receive ground rents, fees, premiums, fines, reversions.
Lloyd George. So what exactly is this leasehold system? If you buy a house freehold, you own the whole thing, the land, the bricks and the mortar. In law, a leaseholder simply buys the right to live in the house for the length of the lease, and in South Wales that's usually 99 years from the time it was built. There are about 130,000 leasehold homes in Wales, and nearly all of them are in the area of the South Wales coalfield, the valleys and the coast from Newport through Cardiff to Swansea. No other part of Britain has such a concentration of leasehold properties. So how did it grow up? Jonathan Wilkie is a Caerphilly solicitor who's made a study of the system.
From a historical point of view, back at the turn of the last century, or even before, during the Industrial Revolution, coal and iron ore was discovered on land owned by landed gentry. And they believed that these mineral resources would run out in about 100 years. So they created 99-year leases of terraced properties that were built on the land in the belief that these properties would revert back to their heirs later on. Second stage seemed to develop around about the early 50s to the mid-60s. A housing boom resulted following the war. However, the incomes were not of such a level where people could afford to buy homes at realistic prices. So builders went about building houses and sold them on a leasehold basis, giving people the option to buy their freehold at a later date. We then come on to the late 60s onwards, and the leasehold properties that have been created since that date have been purely speculative. 99 years or 999-year leases have been created, and the terms in the lease have been tightened in order to give the ground landlord a lucrative income.
The first real change in the leasehold system came in 1967, when another Welsh MP introduced a bill to limit the power of the landlords and give greater security to the leaseholder. He was George Thomas, who came from the terraces of Port Talbot and the Rhondda to become MP for Cardiff West and later Speaker of the House of Commons. His Leasehold Reform Act gave people the right to buy the freehold of their home or to extend the lease and continue to live in it.
The whole purpose of that act was to avoid the exploitation of owner-occupiers by ground landlords. It had gone on through the ages. That awful system whereby the ground landlord claimed not only the ground, but the property for which he hadn't spent a penny. The man who has bought his home has put his capital into it. It's his home. I think that human rights for owner-occupiers are at least as important as owner rights for ground landlords.
Lord Tonypandy's Act cleared the way for leaseholders to buy their freeholds, but it didn't remove all the problems, as many people in the older parts of Cardiff discovered in the late 1970s. Their freeholds were originally part of the Plymouth estate, but they'd been bought up by the BP Pension Trust. Pat Clancy lives in Cathays in the inner city.
Well, one evening in September 1979, letters were dropped through letterboxes in the area late at night for demand for £3,200 to buy the freehold or pay the ground rent instead of £225 a year to £220 a year, an increase of about 10,000%. Most people in the area, old people, were frightened by the notices. They weren't even delivered by post late at night. I heard he was most upset about it. So we held meetings locally, local schools, got support, demonstrations. Went to London, House of Commons. We saw the Secretary for Wales, Mr. Wyn Roberts, who was very unhelpful. And no political party wanted to know the problem. But the only party that did was Plaid Cymru. But after a lot of correspondence, lasting nearly 2 years, we took it to the local land tribunal, which was, I think, the first held in the area. And they reduced the price from £3,200 to just under £1,000, which we thought was a bit of a victory.
The tribunal which cut the price of Cardiff freeholds by more than 2/3 had been set up under the 1980 Housing Act to deal with cases where the leaseholder and the landlord couldn't agree a price. But BP appealed against the ruling, and the Lands Tribunal in London reached a new figure of £1,800. BP then made a special offer to elderly leaseholders to help them buy their freeholds at a cut price. So does Pat Clancy look back on their campaign as a success?
I would say a partial success. I wouldn't say success. The only success we'll ever get is when the entire system is reformed. Because the local tribunal was in favour, but then again, when you go to the main land tribunal, only people can afford this. You've got these people buying these leaseholds out of the country, thousands of pounds. They can go to the land tribunal with us, barristers and so on. For the ordinary person to get a barrister to fight a case, the land tribunal, is costing between £10,000 and £15,000. And most people can't afford it anyway. If they could, it'd be cheaper to buy the lease at inflated price than pay the cost.
Most people, when they buy a leasehold house, think they'll only have to pay their ground rent of, say, £15 a year, and that'll be the end of it. But as Jonathan Wilkie explains, the lease covers a lot more than the ground rent.
A modern lease will stipulate that the property must be insured through a particular company and through the agency of the freeholder. It is common now for large freeholders to insist upon one company being used because they can negotiate higher commission terms with a particular insurance company. Another important point is that if you live in a leasehold property, you cannot improve that property structurally without obtaining the freeholder's consent. Now, certain freeholders will make a charge. I have come across cases in South Wales where up to £70 is being charged to peruse the plans. Once the plans have been approved, the ground landlord may increase the ground rent to cover the extra area of ground being occupied. Ground rent may only go up by, say, £6 or £12, but that will increase the amount you have to pay for the freeholder if you multiply the actual price that's being asked for the freehold. And finally, if the ground rent is to be altered, a deed of variation of ground rent will have to be drawn up, and you will be responsible for the freeholder's legal fees. It goes on beyond that as well, that the ground rent is payable under the terms of the lease, whether demanded or not. It must be paid on the dates specified in the lease. It is down to the landlord's benevolent nature to write to the tenant and ask him for the money. He doesn't have to do that. With certain ground landlords, they will send one demand. If nothing is received after that, they will then pursue the ground rent through the courts. And the tenant will then be responsible for the landlord's solicitor's legal fees.
Of course, since 1967, leaseholders have had an escape route. They can buy the freehold. And since 1980, a tribunal can be asked to fix a fair price. But it's not always as easy as it sounds. Mrs. Shirley Hooper, who lives in a small, unmodernised house at Kenfig Hill in Mid Glamorgan, has been trying to buy the freehold of her home since 1976. The original landlord told her it would cost £45 just to have the house valued, and since this was a week's wages for Mrs. Hooper's husband at the time, they went no further. In 1982, she received a letter saying her freehold had been bought by Castlebeg, and there began a saga of confusion with most of Lloyd George's good fairies involved. Receivers, agents, surveyors, lawyers, and at least two parties claiming to be the ground landlord. To cut a long story short, Mrs. Hooper has still not been able to exercise her legal right to buy the freehold.
We're ordinary folk. We understand we've got the legal right to buy our freehold. We've been blocked now for the last 3 years. And it seems, I feel that I could go on until I'm an old age pensioner and still not achieve buying our freehold.
The company who are trying to buy the freehold of Mrs. Hooper's home are Castlebeg of Jersey. The managing director is a Welshman, Michael Baron Pascoe, who now lives in the Channel Islands. The company are thought to be the biggest single ground landlord in South Wales, owning freeholds from Swansea to Newport and across the valleys. They actively look for freeholds they can buy as a commercial investment, and it's their activities which have given birth to the latest leasehold reform campaign. Ron Davis, the MP for Caerphilly, helped to draft Gareth Wardell's bill. He says he was unhappy about the tone of letters Castlebeg send to some of their tenants, although he admits that the company are acting perfectly within the law.
As far as Castlebeg is concerned, it seems that they have operated within the strict letter of the law, and my attitude is the strict letter of the law has to be changed.
A year ago, the South Wales Leaseholders Association was formed, and it now has members throughout the three Glamorgans and Gwent. John Spencer is the association's chairman, and he's also concerned about some of the correspondence sent out by ground landlords.
There are people who live in leasehold properties who are young married couples. They've got no experience of the sort of letters that have been dropping through the boxes. Pensioners have been intimidated by the tone of the letter, simply because they see the phrase forfeiture of your lease and think, my God, the bailiffs are coming to knock on the door.
Dear sirs,
It is observed that although you have been reminded that the ground rent is due, it has not yet been paid. The amount due is £12.50, plus costs of £7.50, which have been incurred as a result of your delay. Pursuant to Section 146(3) Law of Property Act 1925, you are also responsible for these costs, and thus the total now due is £20. If we do not receive the said total sum within 14 days, we will, without further notice, either instruct certified bailiffs to distrain upon your goods for the full amount, or instruct our solicitors to seek forfeiture of your lease. We suggest, if you do not understand the contents of this letter, to consult your solicitor immediately.
That's the kind of letter which any ground landlord is perfectly entitled to send to someone who's failed to pay their rent on time. In fact, it was sent out by Castlebeg. We spoke to Paul Pascoe, one of the company's directors. He was not willing to record an interview, but this is what he said.
Everyone agrees that the way we manage our business is perfectly legal. Some people say it's aggressive, but we disagree. We say we comply with the law as it stands. We bought our freeholds in good faith, and if someone is going to pass a bill to reduce the value or take our rights away, we must be compensated for the loss of our rights. All I can say is that we've bought the freeholds in good faith as an investment, not to be medieval or bad in any way, but simply as an investment. People who buy leases are always advised by solicitors, and they would be failing in their duty if they did not advise them of their obligations. If they don't like it, they can try to buy something freehold. And they may find they can't, because these properties are not being built. The best they can get is a lease. If they pay their rent on time and insure the property, they'll be able to live there peacefully without problems.
If you forget to pay on time, though, you can have problems, as Susan Scoon of Tontague found out to her cost. Her ground rent of £8.25 was due on June the 24th last year. Castlebeg say they invoiced her on the 1st of June and sent a reminder on the 15th of July. But Mrs. Scoon told us that the first letter she received from them was on August the 21st. It informed her that the lease on her home had been forfeited.
Immediately we wrote to Castlebeg, we sent them the cheque for the ground rent, and the next we heard from them was that the ground rent cheque wasn't going to be cashed because we owed them £56 costs, which they'd incurred by forfeiting the lease.
Do you know whether they actually went through a legal proceeding to recover the lease on this property?
We don't know. We don't know. They say that they did, and we questioned them. We asked for proof of this, and they didn't come up with anything at all. We disputed it with them, but they were pretty adamant that we owed them this money. And in the end, they went to our building society to get it off them.
So it's been added on to your mortgage? It's been
added on to the mortgage, and obviously with the interest rate over 25 years, it's going to cost us a fair bit of money, unless we pay them in lump sum.
How do you feel about that?
Very annoyed.
Tony Barnwell, who's the Welsh representative of the Building Societies Association and regional manager for one of the big societies, explained to me that Mrs. Scoon's society had no choice but to pay Castlebeg because of the danger that they might lose their security.
I think building societies have got a responsibility to their homeowners to try to help them where there is, if and where there is evidence of a freeholder acting unreasonably because they happen to own the freehold, because possibly they purchased that interest from another freeholder, possibly a builder or something like that. The original freeholder having been a perfectly reputable company. And there are many sales of leases made by freeholders to other people who gain them. I am concerned with that very small minority who may be attempting to make a fast pound note out of borrowers.
So where do the building societies stand in the campaign for leasehold reform?
We have given it support all the way along the line, and we are always pleased to help our borrowers who come to us with regard to seeking a further advance to purchase their freehold. That has always been a priority reason for granting a further advance, even when we were very short of funds in the when the Act was first became law. And so we're totally for it.
So if somebody comes to you and says, I'd like to buy the freehold on my house, and it's going to cost me maybe £1,500, you're willing to consider a further loan?
We certainly are, and because normally speaking, we have to, of course, to carry out a revaluation of the property, and normally speaking, the acquisition of the freehold interest is not only beneficial to the borrower, otherwise he wouldn't be buying it, but it is beneficial to the society's security.
It's not just the way the leasehold system operates in detail which the campaigners object to. As John Spencer explains, they dislike the fact that ground landlords can make money out of the ownership of freeholds.
We know from recent conversations with various people that the company that we're talking about, Castlebeg Investments, own about 11,000 properties.
Is that all in South Wales?
The majority, but not totally. There are others in the West Midlands, which we believe that the company also own. But let's go back to 11,000 properties, make an assumption of £22 of ground rent, and the company are making an income of something like £242,000. They paid, we estimate, just marginal over £3 million to purchase the interest in these properties. Now, that is a payment of £3 million, an income of £242,000, but you add to that insurance commission, which the company will also get, of somewhere in the region of £170,000. So we can assume that they are getting very, very close on £500,000 per year income from the properties that they presently own. Their outgoings are probably to pay off bank loans, loans from financiers, people that have sort of loaned the company the money to invest. But we estimate that they should recover their initial capital investment within a period of between 6 and 9 years, which means that everything after that is pure profit at £500,000 a year at present day prices.
Do you feel that's an unreasonable profit?
I feel that it's a profit being made off the backs of people who can ill afford it, by people who are taking advantage of a loophole in the law that shouldn't exist.
Not surprisingly, Castlebeg would not discuss the details of their business with us. Paul Pascoe says the return on their investment is private information. As we've already heard, he stresses the fact that the company keep within the law, and he particularly rejects allegations that they don't send out demands for ground rent payments.
We send an invoice 3 weeks before the rent is due. 6 weeks later, we send a reminder stating that if it isn't paid, proceedings will be taken. If that's not complied with, we either institute proceedings or instruct bailiffs. We're running a business. If we're owed 250 arrears, we can't write that off. The letters are sent out to everyone. Even if they weren't sent out, which they are, we would be well within our rights in enforcing our arrears. Why don't they simply pay them when they are due?
There's certainly no argument with Mr. Pascoe's last point. But would-be reformers like Gareth Wardell object to the system itself. His bill would make it illegal to sell new houses on leasehold, and the only person to whom a freehold could be sold would be the occupier of the property. There'd be a fixed formula for deciding the price of a freehold, and there'd be a right of appeal to the Lands Tribunal only on a point of law. Finally, leaseholders would be free to insure their homes with any reputable insurance company. Mr. Wardell's bill stands little chance of getting past its second reading on February the 14th, because the government's unlikely to make time for it. If the law is not reformed, John Spencer of the Leaseholders Association says people should think hard before buying leasehold.
For people who are looking around for new houses, I would advise them to think very carefully before they consider buying any house offered for sale on a leasehold basis. We feel that they are going to be buying trouble.
While Gareth Wardell is pressing for further reform, there are those who believe the system works perfectly well, allowing ground landlords to make a legitimate return on their investment. But the trustees of the Duke of Westminster's estate, which includes the London district of Belgravia, want the clock turned back to the days before George Thomas's Leasehold Reform Act of 1967. They've argued before the European Court of Human Rights that when their leaseholders exercise the right to buy, the Duke is being deprived of his property unreasonably. Viscount Tonapandi has little sympathy with their argument.
If any government in this land tried to change the law to stop people being able to buy the freehold of their home at a fair and reasonable price, I wouldn't put much money, I'm not a betting man, I'm a Methodist, but I wouldn't put much money on their existence. No, the European Court can say what it likes. And on this, the government would be dependent on the High Court of Parliament agreeing to change the law, taking away the right which now exists for owner-occupiers to buy the freehold of their homes. Makes my blood tingle to think that they want to put the clock back to what it was before 1967. If by accident the rich people of Belgravia gain by this system, so be it. I'm not willing to make the little people who own their house, say in Tidraw Street, Port Talbot, or in Ely Street, Tonapandi, why should they lose their rights because a great landowner, whom nobody would describe as hard up, a great landowner says, I'm not making as much as I ought to be making. Oh, you know, you only have to put the argument to realise how unreasonable it is.
Viscount Tonapandi. And in the Commons, Gareth Wardell, like Lloyd George before him, believes the pressure for change is irresistible.
Over the last 2 years, the Building Societies Association, the Law Society, the National Consumer Council, the Welsh Consumer Council, the Wales Leaseholders Association, and the Office of Fair Trading have all called for reform in one or several aspects of the leasehold system. The new G Committee report is expected shortly and will also have recommendations to make on the topic. It would therefore seem that well-researched and reasoned reform is both possible and timely. During the past 2 years, South Wales MPs, I think all of us perhaps without exception, have received representations from constituents who are leaseholders about harassment and pressure from unscrupulous ground landlords. Perhaps no more so than my honourable friend, the member for Caerphilly. We are agreed that our constituents are being harassed and being made to feel insecure. We assume because the landlords want to pressurise the leaseholders into purchase of their lease on the landlord's terms. And yet we have been helpless to stop these practices because the landlord is not acting illegally. When MPs and Parliament cannot protect the people from the law, then it is past time that the law was changed.
No more leases, no more kindly landlords with all their retinue of good fairies, agents, surveyors, lawyers, ready always to receive ground rents, fees, premiums, fines, reversion.